The Return by Algernon Blackwood, and read by Christopher Holton. It was curious, that sense of dull uneasiness that came over him so suddenly, so stealthily at first he scarcely noticed it, but with such marked increase after a time that he presently got up and left the theatre. His seat was on the gangway of the dress circle, and he slipped out awkwardly in the middle of what seemed to be the best and jolliest song of the piece. The full house was shaking with laughter. So infectious was the gaiety that even strangers turned to one another as much as to say, "Now, isn't that funny?" It was curious, too, the way the feeling first got into him at all, and in the full swing of laughter, music, light-heartedness, for it came as a vague suggestion. "I've forgotten something I meant to do, something of importance. What in the world was it now?" And he thought hard, searching vainly through his mind, then dismissed it as the dancing caught his attention. It came back a little later again, during a passage of long-winded talk that bored him, and set his attention free once more, but came more strongly this time, insisting on an answer. What could it have been that he had overlooked, left undone, omitted to see to? It went on nibbling at the subconscious part of him. Several times this happened, this dismissal and return, till at last the thing declared itself more plainly, and he felt bothered, troubled, distinctly uneasy. He was wanted somewhere. There was somewhere else he ought to be. That describes it best, perhaps. Some engagement of moment had entirely slipped his memory, an engagement that involved another person too. But where? What with whom? And at length this vague uneasiness amounted to positive discomfort, so that he felt unable to enjoy the piece, and left abruptly. Like a man to whom comes suddenly the horrible idea that the match he lit his cigarette with and flung into the waste-paper basket on leaving was not really out. A sort of panic distress. He jumped into a taxicab and hurried to his flat to find everything in order, of course. No smoke, no fire, no smell of burning. But his evening was spoiled. He sat smoking in his armchair at home, this businessman of 40, practical in mind, of character some call stolid, cursing himself for an imaginative fool. It was now too late to go back to the theatre. The club bored him. He spent an hour with the evening papers, dipping into books, sipping a long cool drink, doing odds and ends about the flat. "I'll go to bed early for a change," he laughed. But really all the time fighting, yes, deliberately fighting, this strange attack of uneasiness that so insidiously grew upwards, outwards from the buried depths of him that sought so strenuously to deny it. It never occurred to him that he was ill. He was not ill. His health was thunderingly good. He was as robust as a coal heaver. The flat was roomy, high up on the top floor, yet in a busy part of town, so that the roar of traffic mounted round it like a sea. Through the open windows came the fresh night air of June. He had never noticed before how sweet the London night air could be, and that not all the smoke and dust could smother a certain touch of wild fragrance that tinctured it with perfume. Yes, almost perfume, as of the country. He swallowed a draught of it as he stood there, staring out across the tangled world of roofs and chimney pots. He saw the procession of the clouds, he saw the stars. He saw the moonlight falling in a shower of silver spears upon the slates and wires and steeples. And something in him quickened, something that had never stirred before. He turned with a horrid start, for the uneasiness had of a sudden leaped within him like an animal. There was someone in the flat. Instantly, with action, even this slight action, the fancy vanished. But all the same, he switched on the electric lights and made a search. For it seemed to him that someone had crept up close behind him, while he stood there watching the night. Someone whose silent presence fingered with unerring touch both this new thing that had quickened in his heart, and that sense of original deep uneasiness. He was amazed at himself, angry, indignant that he could be thus foolishly upset over nothing, yet at the same time profoundly distressed at this vehement growth of a new thing in his well-ordered personality. Growth. He dismissed the word the moment it occurred to him, but it had occurred to him. It stayed. While he searched the empty flat, the long passages, the gloomy bedroom at the end, the little hall where he kept his overcoats and golf sticks, it stayed. Growth. It was oddly disquieting. Growth to him involved, though he neither acknowledged nor recognized the truth perhaps, some kind of undesirable changeableness, instability, unbalance. Yet singular as it all was, he realized that the uneasiness and the sudden appreciation of beauty that was so new to him had both entered by the same door into his being. When he came back to the front room, he noticed that he was perspiring. There were little drops of moisture on his forehead, and down his spine ran chills, little faint quivers of cold. He was shivering. He lit his big meerschaum pipe and left the lights all burning. The feeling that there was something he had overlooked, forgotten, left undone, had vanished. Whatever the original cause of this absurd uneasiness might be, he called it absurd on purpose because he now realized in the depths of him that it was really more vital than he cared about. It was much nearer to discovery than before. It dodged about just below the threshold of discovery. It was as close as that. Any moment he would know what it was. He would remember. Yes, he would remember. Meanwhile, he was in the right place. No desire to go elsewhere afflicted him as in the theatre. Here was the place, here in the flat. And then it was with a kind of sudden burst and rush. It seemed to him the only way to phrase it, memory gave up her dead. At first he only caught her peeping round the corner at him, drawing aside a corner of an enormous curtain, as it were, striving for a more complete entrance, as though the mass of it were difficult to move. But he understood. He knew, he recognized, it was enough for that. As an entrance into his being, heart, mind, soul was being attempted, and the entrance, because of his stolid temperament, was difficult of accomplishment. There was effort, strain. Something in him had first to be opened up, widened, made soft and ready as by an operation, before full entrance could be effected. This much he grasped, though for the life of him he could not have put it into words. Also he knew who it was that sought an entrance. Deliberately from himself he withheld the name. But he knew as surely as though Strachan stood in the room and faced him with a knife, saying, let me in, I wish you to know I'm here. I'm clearing away. You recall our promise." He rose from his chair and went to the open window again, the strange fear slowly passing. The cool air fanned his cheeks. Beauty till now had scarcely ever brushed the surface of his soul. He had never troubled his head about it. It passed him by indifferent, and he had ever loathed the mouthy prating of it on others' lips. He was practical. Beauty was for dreamers, for women, for men who had means and leisure. He had not exactly scorned it, rather it had never touched his life to sweeten, to cheer, to uplift. Artists for him were like monks, another sex almost, useless beings who never helped the world go round. He was for action always, work, activity, achievement as he saw them. He remembered Strachan vaguely, Strachan, the ever impecunious friend of his youth, always talking of colour and sound, mysterious, ineffectual things. He even forgot what they had quarrelled about, if they had quarrelled at all even, or why they had gone apart all these years ago. And certainly he had forgotten any promise. Memory as yet only peeped at him, round the corner of that huge curtain tentatively, suggestively, yet he was obliged to admit it somewhat winningly. He was conscious of this gentle, sweet seductiveness that now replaced his fear. And as he stood now at the open window peering over huge London, beauty came close and smote him between the eyes. She came blindingly with her train of stars and clouds and perfumes. Night, mysterious, myriad-eyed and flaming across her sea of haunted shadows, invaded his heart and shook him with her immemorial wonder and delight. He found no words, of course, to clothe the new unwanted sensations. He only knew that all his former dread, uneasiness, distress, and with them this idea of growth that had seemed so repugnant to him, were merged, swept up, and gathered magnificently home into a wave of beauty that enveloped him. "See it and understand," ran a secret inner whisper across his mind. He saw. He understood. He went back and turned the lights out. Then he took his place again at that open window, drinking in the night. He saw a new world. A species of intoxication held him. He sighed as his thoughts blundered for expression among words and sentences that knew him not. But the delight was there, the wonder, the mystery. He watched with heart alternately tightening and expanding the transfiguring play of moon and shadow over the sea of buildings. He saw the dance of the hurrying clouds, the open patches into outer space, the veiling and unveiling of that ancient silvery face, and he caught strange whispers of the hierophantic sacerdotal power that has echoed down the world since time began, and dropped strange magic phrases into every poet's heart, since first God dawned on chaos. The beauty of the night. A long time passed. It may have been 1 hour, it may have been 3, when at length he turned away and went slowly to his bedroom. A deep peace lay over him. Something quite new and blessed had crept into his life and thought. He could not quite understand it all. He only knew that it uplifted. There was no longer the least sign of affliction or distress. Even the inevitable reaction that set in could not destroy that. And then, as he lay in bed nearing the borderland of sleep, suddenly and without any obvious suggestion to bring it, he remembered another thing. He remembered the promise. Memory got past the big curtain for an instant and showed her face. She looked into his eyes. It must have been a dozen years ago when Strohan and he had made that foolish solemn promise that whoever died first should show himself if possible to the other. He had utterly forgotten it till now. But Strohan had not forgotten it. The letter came 3 weeks later from India. That very evening Strohan had died, at 9 o'clock, and he had come back, in the beauty that he loved. The end. The Goblin Collection by Algernon Blackwood, and read by Christopher Holton. Dutton accepted the invitation for the feeble reason that he was not quick enough at the moment to find a graceful excuse. He had none of that facile brilliance which is so useful at weekend parties. He was a big, shy, awkward man. Moreover, he disliked these great houses. They swallowed him. The solemn, formidable butlers oppressed him. He left on Sunday night when possible. This time, arriving with an hour to dress, he went upstairs to an enormous room, so full of precious things that he felt like an insignificant item in a museum corridor. He smiled disconsolately as the underling who brought up his bag began to fumble with the lock. But instead of the sepulchral utterance he dreaded, a delicious human voice with an unmistakable brogue proceeded from the stooping figure. It was positively comforting. "It all be locked, sir, but maybe you have the key?" And they bent together over the disreputable kit bag, looking like a pair of ants knitting antennae on the floor of some great cave. The giant four-poster watched them contemptuously. Mahogany cupboards wore an air of grave surprise. The gaping open fireplace alone could have swallowed all his easels, almost, indeed, his little studio. This human Irish presence was distinctly consoling. Some extra hand or other, thought Dutton probably. He talked a little with the lad, then, lighting a cigarette, he watched him put the clothes away in the capacious cupboards, noticing in particular how neat and careful he was with the little things. Nail scissors, silver stud box, metal shoehorn and safety razor, even the bright cigar cutter and pencil sharpener collected loose from the bottom of the bag. All these he placed in a row upon the dressing table with the glass top, and seemed never to have done with it. He kept coming back to rearrange and put a final touch, lingering over them absurdly. Dutton watched him with amusement, then surprise, finally with exasperation. Would he never go? "Thank you," he said at last. "That will do. I'll dress now." "What time is dinner?" the lad told him, but still lingered, evidently anxious to say more. "Everything's out, I think," repeated Dutton impatiently. "All the loose things, I mean." The face at once turned eagerly. What mischievous Irish eyes he had, to be sure. "I've put him all together in a row, sir, so that you'll not be missing anything at all," was the quick reply, as he pointed to the ridiculous collection of little articles, and even darted back to finger them again. He counted them one by one, and then suddenly he added, with a touch of personal interest that was not familiarity, It's so easy, you see, sir, to lose them small bright things in this great room. And he was gone. Smiling a little to himself, Dutton began to dress, wondering how the lad had left the impression that his words meant more than they said. He almost wished he had encouraged him to talk. The small bright things in this great room. What an admirable description, almost a criticism. He felt like a prisoner of state in the tower. He stared about him into the alcoves, recesses, deep embrasured windows. The tapestries and huge curtains oppressed him. Next he fell to wondering who the other guests would be, whom he would take into dinner, how early he could make an excuse and slip off to bed. Then, midway in these desultory thoughts, became suddenly aware of a curiously sharp impression that he was being watched. Somebody quite close was looking at him. He dismissed the fancy as soon as it was born, putting it down to the size and mystery of the old-world chamber. But in spite of himself, the idea persisted teasingly, and several times he caught himself turning nervously to look over his shoulder. It was not a ghostly feeling. His nature was not accessible to ghostly things. The strange idea lodged securely in his brain was traceable, he thought, to something the Irish lad had said, grew out rather of what he left unsaid. He idly allowed his imagination to encourage it. Someone friendly but curious, with inquisitive peeping eyes, was watching him. Someone very tiny was hiding in the enormous room. He laughed about it, but he felt different. A certain big protective feeling came over him that he must go gently lest he tread on some diminutive living thing that was soft as a kitten and elusive as a baby mouse. Once, indeed, out of the corner of his eye, he fancied he saw a little thing with wings go fluttering past the great purple curtains at the other end. It was by a window. A bird or something outside, he told himself with a laugh, yet moved thenceforth more often than not on tiptoe. This cost him a certain effort. His proportions were elephantine. He felt a more friendly interest now in the stately, imposing chamber. The dressing gong brought him back to reality and stopped the flow of his imagining. He shaved and laboriously went on dressing then. He was slow and leisurely in his movements, like many big men, very orderly too. But when he was ready to put in his collar stud, it was nowhere to be found. It was a worthless bit of brass, but most important, he had only one. 5 minutes ago it had been standing inside the ring of his collar on the marble slab. He had carefully placed it there. Now it had disappeared and left no trail. He grew warm and untidy in the search. It was something of a business for Dutton to go on all fours. "Malicious little beast," he grunted, rising from his knees. His hand sore where he had scraped it beneath the cupboard. His trouser crease was ruined, his hair was tumbled. He knew too well the elusive activity of similar small objects. "It will turn up again," he tried to laugh, "if I pay it no attention. Moll." He abruptly changed the adjective as though he had nearly said a dangerous thing. Naughty little imp. He went on dressing, leaving the collar to the last. He fastened the cigar cutter to this chain, but the nail scissors, he noticed now, had also gone. Odd, he reflected, very odd. He looked at the place where they had been a few minutes ago. Odd, he repeated, and finally, in desperation, he rang the bell. The heavy curtains swung inwards as he said, "Come in answer to the knock," and the Irish boy, with the merry dancing eyes, stood in the room. He glanced half nervously, half expectantly about him. "It'll be something ye have lost, Sora," he said at once, as though he knew. "I rang," said Dutton, resenting it a little, "to ask you if you could get me a collar stud for this evening. Anything will do." He did not say he had lost his own. Someone, he felt, who was listening would chuckle and be pleased. It was an absurd position. "And will it be a stud like this, sor, that ye's wanting?" asked the boy, picking up the lost object from inside the collar on the marble slab. "Like that, yes," stammered the other, utterly amazed. He had overlooked it, of course, yet it was in the identical place where he had left it. He felt mortified and foolish. It was so obvious that the boy grasped the situation, more, had expected it. It was as if the stud had been taken and replaced deliberately. "Thank you," he added, turning away to hide his face as the lad backed out. With a grin, he imagined, though he did not see it. Almost immediately, it seemed, then he was back again, holding out a little cardboard box containing an assortment of ugly bone studs. Dutton felt as if the whole thing had been prepared beforehand. How foolish it was! Yet behind it lay something real and true and utterly incredible. "They won't get taken, sir," he heard the lad say from the doorway. "They're not nearly bright enough." The other decided not to hear. "Thanks," he said curtly. "They'll do nicely." There was a pause, but the boy did not go. Taking a deep breath, he said very quickly, as though greatly daring, "It's only the bright and little lovely things he takes, sir, if you please. He takes them for his collection, and there's no stopping him at all." It came out with a rush, and Dutton, hearing it, let the human thing rise up in him. He turned and smiled. "Oh, he takes these things for his collection, does he?" he asked more gently. The boy looked dreadfully shamefaced, confession hanging on his lips. "The little bright and lovely things, sir, yes. I've done me best, but there's things he can't resist at all. The bone ones is safe, though. He won't look at them." "I suppose he followed you across from Ireland, eh?" the other inquired. The lad hung his head. "I told Father Madden," he said in a lower voice, "but it's not the least bit of good in the world." He looked as though he had been convicted of stealing and feared to lose his place. Suddenly, lifting his blue eyes, he added, "But if you take no notice at all, he generally puts everything back in its place again. He only borrows them, just for a little bit of time. Pretend you're not wanting them at all, sir, and back they'll come presently again, brighter than before, maybe." "I see," answered Dutton slowly. "All right then," he dismissed him, "and I won't say a word downstairs. You needn't be afraid," as the lad looked his gratitude and vanished like a flash, leaving the other with a queer and eerie feeling, staring at the ugly bone studs. He finished dressing hurriedly and went downstairs. He went on tiptoe out of the great room, moving delicately and with care, lest he might tread on something very soft and tiny, almost wounded, like a butterfly with a broken wing, and from the corners he felt positive something watched him go. The ordeal of dinner passed off well enough, the rather heavy evening too. He found the opportunity to slip off early to bed. The nail scissors were in their place again. He read till midnight, nothing happened. His hostess had told him the history of his room, inquiring kindly after his comfort. "Some people feel rather lost in it," she said. "I hope you found all you want." And tempted by her choice of words, the lost and found, he nearly told the story of the Irish lad whose goblin had followed him across the sea and borrowed little bright and lovely things for his collection. But he kept his word. He told nothing. She would only have stared, for one thing. For another, he was bored and therefore uncommunicative. He smiled inwardly. All that this giant mansion could produce for his comfort and amusement were ugly bone studs, a thieving goblin, and a vast bedroom where dead royalty had slept. Next day, at intervals when changing for tennis or back again for lunch, the borrowing continued. The little things he needed at the moment had disappeared. They turned up later. To ignore their disappearance was the recipe for their recovery. Invariable, too, just where he had seen them last. There was the lost object shining in his face, propped impishly on its end, just ready to fall upon the carpet, and ever with a quizzical, malicious air of innocence that was truly goblin. His collar stud was the favourite. Next came the scissors and the silver pencil sharpener. Trains and motors combined to keep him Sunday night, but he arranged to leave on Monday before the other guests were up, and so got early to bed. He meant to watch. There was a merry, jolly feeling in him that he had established quasi-friendly relations with the little borrower. He might even see an object go, catch it in the act of disappearing. He arranged the bright objects in a row upon the glass-topped dressing table opposite the bed, and while reading kept an eye slyly on the array of tempting bait. But nothing happened. "It's the wrong way," he realized suddenly. "What a blunderer I am!" He turned the light out then. Drowsiness crept over him. Next day, of course, he told himself it was a dream. The night was very still. and through the lattice windows stole faintly the summer moonlight. Outside, the foliage rustled a little in the wind. A nightjar called from the fields, and a secret furry owl made answer from the copse beyond. The body of the chamber lay in thick darkness, but a slanting ray of moonlight caught the dressing table and shone temptingly upon the silver objects. "It's like setting a night line," was the last definite thought he remembered, when the laughter that followed stopped suddenly, and his nerves gave a jerk that turned him keenly alert. From the enormous open fireplace, gaping in darkness at the end of the room, issued a thread of delicate sound that was softer than a feather. A tiny flurry of excitement, furtive, tentative, passed shivering across the air. An exquisite dainty flutter stirred the night, and through the heavy human brain upon the great four-poster fled this picture, as from very far away, picked out in black and silver, of a wee knight-errant crossing the frontiers of fairyland, high mischief in his tiny beating heart. Pricking along over the big, thick carpet, he came towards the bed, towards the dressing table, intent upon bold plunder. Dutton lay motionless as a stone and watched and listened. The blood in his ears smothered the sound a little, but he never lost it altogether. The flicking of a mouse's tail or whiskers could hardly have been more gentle than this sound, more wary, circumspect, discreet, certainly not half so artful. Yet the human being in the bed, so heavily breathing, heard it well. Closer it came, and closer. Oh, so elegant and tender, this bold attack of a wee adventurer from another world. It shot swiftly past the bed. With a little flutter, delicious, almost musical, it rose in the air before his very face, and entered the pool of moonlight on the dressing table. Something blurred it then. The human sight grew troubled and confused a moment. A mingling of moonlight with the reflections from the mirror, slab of glass, and shining objects obscured clear vision somehow. For a second, Dutton lost the proper focus. There was a tiny rattle and a tiny click. He saw that the pencil sharpener stood balanced on the table's very edge. It was in the act of vanishing. But for his stupid blunder, then he might have witnessed more. He simply could not restrain himself, it seems. He sprang, and at the same instant the silver object fell upon the carpet. Of course, his elephantine leap made the entire table shake, but anyhow he was not quick enough. He saw the reflection of a slim and tiny hand slide down into the mirrored depths of the reflecting sheet of glass. Deep, deep down, and swift as a flash of light. This, he thinks, he saw, though the light, he admits, was oddly confusing in that moment of violent and clumsy movement. One thing, at any rate, was beyond all question. The pencil sharpener had disappeared. He turned the light up. He searched for a dozen minutes, then gave it up in despair, and went back to bed. Next morning he searched again. But having overslept himself, he did not search as thoroughly as he might have done. For halfway through the tiresome operation, the Irish lad came in to take his bag for the train. "Will it be something you've lost, sir?" he asked gravely. "Oh, it's all right," Dutton answered from the floor. "You can take the bag and my overcoat." And in town that day he bought another pencil sharpener and hung it on his chain. The end.